Hello, UCAR. Peter Christensen here, coming to you from the what's going on back there? The remodeled, this actually isn't anywhere close to the CEO's desk, but it is in our office. Cool brick wall. Anyway, joining us, even better than the brick wall, is Kreg Wagner, UAR legal counsel extraordinaire. You may know him from previous hits such as Legal Panel last year, or Legal Panel the year before that, or Legal Panel the year before that. I'm not going to go any further, but you catch my drift. So Craig's jumping on with us today. I'm very excited about it. We had an interesting conversation the other day about, it's kind of, again, goes back to the basics a little bit in amending a contract, and this concept we have in Utah where you can, I always call it the addendum train, right? You can build addenda and they reference back to each other, and it creates this train of thoughts and ideas and concepts. And there's sometimes a bit of confusion as to what makes it in, what doesn't. And there are these little, so important boxes of acceptance, rejection, and counteroffer, and what do those do and how do those affect the transaction or the deal. So Kreg, I'm going to pass it off to you to lay out the first concept.
Yeah, I think the first concept is one that many people struggle with, is the idea of how to form a contract in the first place. Again, a very basic and elementary principle, but an important one nonetheless. So the idea of an acceptance deadline. I know Peter and I have really kind of championed this phrase, acceptance deadline, as opposed to a response deadline, right? There isn't a response deadline, there's an acceptance deadline. So a finite window of time in order for the offer to be accepted. But you can respond after that deadline has lapsed. You just can't accept because there's no longer an offer to accept. So the first concept I just wanted to address very briefly is the idea of, once an acceptance deadline has lapsed, the other side is still free to counter that offer by simply sending over a counter offer. And that, in essence, revives those previous terms that aren't specifically modified. So if the only thing you're changing in your counter offer is the purchase price, and you send that counter over and the other side accepts it within that window of time, all the other terms remain the same. They are part of the counter offer or the new offer back to the other side.
Okay, excellent. So what you're saying is, even if I didn't address it, if I counter, there are 5 items in addendum number 1 that comes over to me. I counter with addendum number 2, and I only change item number 1 and I ignore 2 through 5. Those would be assumed or presumed to be a part of the next counter offer number 2 because they're not addressed. Now, what's the language that makes this magic happen in this contract?
Yeah, there's language at the bottom of every addendum that talks about what terms survive and what terms are changed with a counter offer. I wish I had it memorized verbatim, but it says something to the effect that that if there's any sort of conflict between the terms of the counter offer and any other existing terms of the REPC, including all addenda and counter offers, that these terms shall control, or all the others shall remain the same, something to that effect. So it in essence brings those terms as part of the counter offer, and it's all one offer at that point. So the question in my mind, or at least the point that I would want to emphasize, is that when you're countering, if you're intending to counter all these terms or only agree to certain terms, your counter offer should really spell that out. So to your point, Peter, if I want to only agree to item number 2 on addendum number 1, not 1 and then 3, 4, and 5, I may want to spell that out, saying, in my counter offer, I agree to item number 2 on addendum number 1, items 1, 3, 4, and 5. I'm not agreeing to, or they're not part of my counter offer. Something to that effect, making it clear.
Yeah, exactly. I think because of the system we have, I think it's really a great system. So something doesn't inadvertently get left out, or the presumption of, you know what, I don't have a problem with items 2 through 5, but I do with 1. So I'm asking you in your offer, I'm countering to say, I'll accept 2 through 5 if you will modify 1 in this way, and I spell it out. Even though it works that way, and I think it's great, I would still always spell it out, right? Like you said, to avoid the confusion, I'd always list them out 1 through 5. And I love numbers. I love numbering them, so that each concept can be addressed individually. And I would even be as redundant, if it went to addendum number 3, although we've both said, yeah, we agree to item 2 and 3 and 4, I'd still in the subsequent addenda say, I agree to these, as even though it's redundant. So talk to me about the difference. What's the difference between those boxes when you check acceptance, when you check counteroffer, and when you check reject?
Yeah, I mean, acceptance is pretty clear. You're agreeing to the offer as it's presented. In the law, the acceptance has to be done in what's called the mirror image. You can't accept something in part. It has to be in its entirety. So when you click acceptance, you're accepting everything as is. No changes, no modifications. You're under contract at that point, as long as it's done within the acceptance window, right, by the acceptance deadline. Counteroffer, I think there are a number of ways to think of a counteroffer. The harshest way to think of a counteroffer is that it's a rejection of the original offer, right? I'm just rejecting it. That sounds harsh, but that's what you're doing.
But it is,
Yeah.
Legally, it's a rejection.
It's a rejection, and it's, even if you're only changing one term, I think sometimes it's hard to wrap our minds around that. Well, I'm only changing one term. Okay, but you're still rejecting the original offer as it stood. So it's it is a standalone offer. So it's a brand new offer that has oftentimes many of the original terms of the original offer. So it's both a rejection and a brand new offer that creates a brand new window of time for the other party to accept. Now, a rejection is just that. It's saying, look, I don't accept your offer. They're not even countering the offer. It is just a flat out rejection. And really what needs to happen, if there's any sort of negotiation that's going to happen, a new offer would need to be sent. I mean, that would probably be the cleanest way after rejection, prior to any sort of acceptance.
And so how does this differ? So let's say we have an accepted contract. So now we're not dealing with offer, counter offer in its traditional sense of the original deal, trying to go under contract for, let's say, a home, but we're under contract. And now I send over an addendum, which is in essence asking you for your permission to modify the original deal. We've already agreed on a deal, and now I'm sending over a request to change the terms of the original deal. So do those boxes, are they invalid now, or do they still work in conjunction with now not a counteroffer, an addendum?
Yeah, they're important. They're still important concepts. They're still important in making modifications to an existing contract. But you're right. I've had seasoned agents contact me about those boxes after going under contract. And what does it do? So if there's an acceptance of an addendum after going under contract, or a modification to an existing contract, those terms now become part of the contract, right? They're now binding on the respective parties. So for example, repairs or concessions are typical modifications after going under contract. Great. Now the two parties have changed the contract, and that's perfectly fine. If there's a negotiation, so you send over an addendum and then it gets countered, then again, it's going back and forth. You're trying to reason as to what is now going to be the modification of the contract. And then a flat out rejection is just that. It's one party saying, nope, I don't agree to revise the contract as it stands. It is rejecting that modification. And I want to be clear, this is where I've seen some seasoned agents have some trouble. I've had some listing agents tell me, well, Kreg, we rejected the addendum to modify the contract, therefore the contract cancels, right?
Right. I've heard that.
No. Yeah, I'm not sure where that started, but no, when you don't come to an agreement on the modification of an existing contract, what happens to the contract, Peter? I mean, what contractually happens at that point?
It reverts back to the last accepted terms.
Yeah, I mean, unless the addendum said something to the effect of, and if you don't agree to these terms, this will serve as notice of cancellation, something to that effect, making it a conditional cancellation. Yeah, you're still under contract. You just revert back to what you last agreed to.
Right. Right. Excellent. And I wanted to circle back to something you said at the very beginning, talking about acceptance. I think an important note, and this is kind of what the details we got into, because we're getting a little bit into the weeds, but it's important to understand. And that was what the effect of acceptance in essence is it's closing it. It's shortening that possible train, right? Because now we have an accepted set of terms. Now you can't really counter an accepted set of terms anymore. It's kind of done, right? Once it's accepted, it's part of the rep C now. It's part of the entire contract. So it would be inappropriate. Let's say addendum number 1, they were already under contract. Addendum number 1 comes over, gets accepted by the other side. It would be inappropriate for addendum number 2 to be marked as counter offer. What are you countering? There's no current offer. There's no addendum. There are no additional terms outstanding. There is just now the contract, which includes addendum number 1. And it's important, as well as understanding, as you said, that a counter is rejecting. So once you counter number 1, you're rejecting it, but you're pulling in any terms that you haven't contradicted in addendum number 2. You're pulling those from 1 into number 2. And that's where we talked about having the list, where you're maybe a little redundant, but keep it clear. So, okay, excellent. So in theory, you could have a scenario where you had, let's say, addendum number 1 was accepted. It's part of the contract. Then you have 2, which gets countered with 3. And then 3 gets rejected. Let's say the buyer sends over addendum number 2, asks for some repairs to be done. And then seller counters and changes some of the terms of what buyer was asking for, and maybe changes some deadlines. And buyer says, no, I don't like this. I don't like this, where this is going. So they then mark reject. After that, let's say buyer wanted to kind of readdress the scenario proposed. It still has to do with repairs and whatnot. What would be the appropriate way to now, going into addendum number 4, what would be the appropriate way to mark that? Do you then mark counter offer?
I wouldn't. I would just use addendum number 4, because you're now starting a new train of negotiation. So you had the original train after you're under contract, where you're, in your case, negotiating deadlines, that gets rejected. So that train, in my mind, has now been, terminated. It's now been, look, there's none of those things are being agreed to. And then you're now starting a new line of negotiations, which might include some of the former concepts,
Sure.
but it's a brand new opening of negotiations. And, I know it's easy for me as a non-practitioner to say, look, try to negotiate as much as you can before starting to put it into addenda, but that is a concept. So the idea of negotiating repairs via text message or email or phone call, that's perfectly fine. I mean, the idea of trying to only have 1 or 2 or 3 addenda as opposed to 7 or 8 does simplify the transaction. So, that's a bit of unsolicited advice, but before sending over an addendum, maybe try to get an idea, if you can, as to whether or not the other side would be open to that type of concept.
Oh, they're soliciting when they click on this video, Craig. Make no mistake.
Right.
They want the information.
Sure.
Okay, so yeah, that's, I mean, that it can be a confusing. It almost feels contradictory, but it's not.
Right.
By having that language that says anything not contradicting, or anything contradicting any information, any prior addenda, the REPSI, that type of language, which you're pulling up right now.
Yeah.
So because neither of us got it right. That type of info or that language at the bottom of the addendum feels contradictory to, now we're starting over. We rejected. So why isn't anything from those 2 addenda that got rejected, why isn't it carrying on? So do you have it there?
I do.
Okay.
So this is at the bottom of every single addendum, including the blank addendum.
You would think we'd have it memorized because it's at the bottom of everyone, but
We've got the concepts down, but it's pre-filled whenever we make
spirit of the language.
It's pre-filled out whenever we do any sort of changes. So it's just template language. So here's what it says, but it's important, right? We can't just gloss over it.
It's hugely important.
So it says all other terms of the REPSI, comma, including all prior addenda and counter offers, comma, not modified by this addendum / counter offer shall remain the same.
Excellent. And the way I read that, I mean, it references the contract and then says, including prior addenda and counter offers, comma. In my mind, the way I would look at that as an attorney is that it's saying the contract, including addenda to the contract, which insinuates accepted addenda to the contract. And so that's the way I look at that language, to say, if something's been rejected, it's not subject to that language anymore, because it is not a part of the contract, was never a part of the contract. So that language, in essence, says that addendum that was not accepted was rejected. So those 2 in our scenario, those 2 addenda, number 2 and number 3, that were rejected, marked as rejected, they are not subject to that language because they were never a part of the contract, right? They were never accepted. They never became terms of the contract. So therefore, they're not addenda to the contract. They're rejected. Now we keep them in there, and I would advocate keeping them in there to keep clarity, so you don't take them out and have a second number 3 that does get accepted. I like keeping them numbered sequentially, even if they're not accepted. But they're really not a part of the contract when they're not accepted, when they're rejected. So, there's a big difference in the countered versus the outright rejected. Outright rejected means those terms are gone, not referenced, they're done, versus a counter that ties now the 2, the 3, the 4, however many addenda get countered in a row. They're tied together, and that language is very important, that says anything not contradicted now is drawn into this. So yeah, big, simple line that's in really almost every addendum we have. That line is in there, but it is hugely important. And you and I, I'm coming up, I'm pushing 15 years now of forms committee, legal counsel work for the UR. I couldn't say it verbatim to hear. And you're what are you pushing?
I'm 9.5 years.
You're pushing 10 years.
I know.
So it's funny that language, it's hard for us to recall it verbatim, but it is so important to understand how that language works. I think most of our agents get it right, but
yeah,
there are some subtle nuances. And so great reminder on these. So anything else you want to say about this? Any other thoughts you've had?
No, and I think I would just emphasize what you had said, that for clarity standpoint, if you have a long addenda train of negotiating, so let's say it's 7, 8 addenda going back and forth,
Messy.
it may be prudent to have that last addendum clearly spelling out exactly what you're agreeing to, and maybe even explaining what you're not agreeing to, just to make it clear that there's not anything that's surviving that you may not want to survive.
Awesome. Perfect. Thanks, Kreg. Thanks for jumping in and joining us and adding your wisdom to this topic. It's a good one. And remember, this is not legal advice. This is legal information only. If you need specific legal advice, please contact your attorney. Thanks for tuning in.